going to be talking about Xhosa literature, including a volume that we have produced. Pamela is Associate Professor at the School of Languages and African Studies at Rhodes University. She has worked as the coordinator of the South African-Norway Development Project on multilingualism at Grahamstown and at the University of Cape Town and with the National Language Project. She served as a member of various provincial and national task teams on matters related to language and their role in access and success in higher education for students speaking languages other than English. And she's an executive member of the African Languages Association of Southern Africa. Pamela holds a doctorate in sociolinguistics, and her research interests then have included language policy and planning with a focus on multilingualism and language in education. But she tells me now that she's moving increasingly to an interest in Xhosa literature rather than language. Pamela has also worked with Jeff Opland, who was one of the editors of our Isaac Wauchope volume, editing Xhosa histories and poetry. Jeff Opland has the Jeff Opland collection of Xhosa literature, which Pamela is editing, a series which Pamela is editing with him. So thank you very much for agreeing to speak to us. We're very appreciative.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me at the back? Okay. You can't hear me? Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Okay, should I greet in Xhosa, Molweni? Okay, as you've heard, I'm Pamela Maseko, and I need to make this disclaimer that I am not a historian. I'm a sociolinguist, as you've heard in the bio that was read here. And I just need to tell you my interest, or what caused me to shift from sociolinguistics, or what made me to both do research in sociolinguistics and this area that I'm talking on now. I was brought up by my grandmother in the Eastern Cape, Engcobo. And my grandmother was a very strong woman, a matriarch in the family. My grandfather died very early in life, but my grandmother see to it that the family ran properly, was managed properly. She made sure that the lands were plowed. She made sure that her children went to school, made sure that her grandchildren went to school. So the shift, then you're wondering why I'm talking about my grandmother in that way. The shift then is that when I went to university in higher education, and they were telling or teaching us about African history, or in this case social anthropology, about Xhosa societies, I did not see my grandmother in what was taught. I didn't see what I had experienced in what was taught. There were lots of distortions. There were lots of misinterpretations of what I thought was real to me. So, and then later on in the 80s, I came across the works of Andre Odendaal, who started to write about the early intellectuals of the Eastern Cape. And he writes, I hope you'll understand why I'm confusing my she's and his. Okay, but he, Andre Odendaal, wrote something on Xhosa, who is going to be my main focus today. And in Xhosa's writings, I saw the reality of my society, the reality that I didn't see in writings written by other people, or should I say by outsiders. So I could relate completely from the folk tales he narrated when he was talking about a social phenomenon, the philosophy of the Xhosa people, their thoughts, their ideas, their knowledge. I could relate completely. So when I was given an opportunity then to interact with these works that were published between 1823 to about 1940s, I saw a wealth of knowledge about Xhosa-speaking people, wealth of knowledge in literary texts that had not been until perhaps the 1990s and 2000, that had not been put for wider consumption. So I needed to just say a little bit about why I'm doing what I'm doing. I just want to give an outline so that if I miss anything, or I want to be really strict about time. I hope we can have time to interact with it towards the end. I hope to keep it 45 minutes to 15 minutes and then have a discussion with you. So just an outline, I'm going to talk briefly about the history of the writing of isiXhosa because it's important, because what I'm talking about is really connected to the development of writing system in isiXhosa and how these writers transition from oral beings to literate, as in terms of writing. So I'm going to write a brief. I'm going to talk briefly about that, and I'm going to talk about the emergence of newspapers and how these early intellectuals that I'm talking about use those newspapers as an outlet for their ideas. Now I'm going to talk about what we're doing at Rhodes University in collaboration with the National Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences in putting these literary texts into formal publication, literary texts that were written in newspapers in formal publications. And then I'm just gonna scan through some people that we have worked with, that we have published. And my focus, as I indicated earlier on, will be on William Goba. I'm going to be looking at his excerpts from his writings, and then I'm going to try and give an interpretation of what those writings might mean for us now as we try to grapple with issues of coloniality and so forth. And then draw conclusions and basically, I'm asking a question. I don't have an answer yet, but I'm asking questions. What do these texts mean? Texts that are hidden from us in a space like this in the academy. What do we do with this? What do these texts mean for the current debates on the legacy of colonialism that are not only dominant in terms of knowledge, but that present itself as universal? So this is the outline of this paper. That's a brief introduction. This is what I'm presenting to you is a project on uncovering these voices, hidden voices of early isiXhosa-speaking intellectuals. And for me, it's a concerted refutation of persistent and dominant narrative on South African history. That projects one kind of history as the norm, as the truth, and any other that exists is not known and is not being engaged with. So I'm bringing forward, together with the people I'm working with, that I'm going to be outlining earlier on, what do these histories mean in terms of marginalized and relegated colonial categories and their legacies that have been presented as passive and silent. And like I said, I'm looking at newspapers, writing specifically in newspapers published between the 1830s and the 1840s. Just as a way of introduction as well here is that I think it's known by everybody here that newspaper writings, or rather writing, specifically in isiXhosa or actual African languages in Africa, has been pioneered by missionaries. But often in reflecting about this lecture, what I what I think is important to note is that they were pioneers, but the people who really engaged and provided insight into how we get to write the languages now were these intellectuals. Because I will show later on that the missionaries wrote using their own ways of speaking, so interpreting the sounds, the Xhosa sounds, in the English ways of pronouncing sound. And it was not always accurate in presenting the sound system of isiXhosa. But it is these early intellectuals that engage with us. So what we write now, or how we write now in isiXhosa, is a total reflection of those intellectuals. What is also important that in this lecture is to make note that the use of newspapers by these early intellectuals in writing commentaries or whatever was as a result of the manner in which any work was censored from the African population. Any work that was contributed into writing, submitted in Lovedale Press. Lovedale Press, as you would know, was missionary controlled. So anything that did not conform to the agenda of the missionaries, which was to educate in a manner that was designed for the native, to give Christian education specifically, anything that did not conform to that or that threatened that was not accepted in those publications. So therefore, the early intellectuals were grappling with what it means to be self in the context where self was often relegated to the margins, was oppressed, so to speak. So the newspapers provided an outlet to write these things. So I'm looking specifically, as I said, from newspapers that were published from 1837, which were used by these early intellectuals as an opportunity to talk back to power. Okay, as I said earlier on, until recently, these voices have remained silenced. The writing of isiXhosa was pioneered by missionaries. Often people seem to start in 1823 when John Benny produced that first writing. But there have been early attempts before by people who were shipwrecked along the coast, by explorers and so forth. And the one person who started to write systematically was Van der Kemp, whose word list appears. Actually, no one knows we don't know where the word list is. People have written about it, so we're making reference to that. I have not seen it personally, but the word list was published in 1899. And then John Benny writes in 1821 and then goes to the UK and brings back a printing press, travels with the ox wagon from Cape Town to Grahamstown and prints the first Xhosa print in 1823. And for the missionaries, writing was important for the success of Western education and the teaching of the gospel of Christianity specifically. So they pioneered it. They did everything possible for publications in isiXhosa to be done. So there were prayer books. There were mainly literature related to Christianity, the Gospels, but there was also educational literature, teaching a school alphabet of how to read and write and so forth. So as indicated earlier on, there was tight control on what gets published or doesn't get published. I will show later on what John Benny says about what gets published. So in terms of censorship, James Stewart, right later on, James Stewart comes later as the principal of Lovedale, writes that there is very little in old Cafedom worth preserving. So the people who wrote, these alien intellectuals, if they were to write for missionary presses, they needed not to write anything in relation to their own experience, in relation to their own culture, relation to their own histories, relating to their own knowledge. And according to them, there was nothing worth preserving from the old Cafedom, as he speaks it. And then on an occasion when a chief whose son is at Lovedale, and he wants to take away the son for initiation, there's huge protest, and she writes to this chief that the inducement to young men to forsake their education and leave their employments for the ceremonies of circumcision are so many that we cannot afford to place an additional one before them by showing the halo of song and romance about the performance. So this is belittled, the cultural custom is belittled as halo of song and romance. So the newspaper, again, was an outlet for that, was an outlet for those ideas. I'm just going to go through, mindful of time, I'm just going to go through some of the newspapers that were used by these early intellectuals. So the first periodical, as you can see, these are from our archives, are from Kore Library, for those people who know that part of the world, and the Cape Town National Library in the Gardens. So it was not a normal newspaper, as we know. It's a periodical, and it's I think this one was just 4 pages. First ever newspapers in isiXhosa, and it only produced between 1837 and 1841. As you can see, it's 15. I think it was once every 2-3 months. It was not regular. And as you can see in the title itself, there's lots of Christian values in it. It's Umshumayeli Wendaba, literally in Xhosa, that in English that translates as the preacher of news. And then Isibuto Samavo, although when one looks at the title itself and Isibuto Samavo means it's the collector of ideas and thoughts. So one would think that is ideas and thoughts of indigenous population, but it was not so much on that. And this one specifically, they write mainly stories that are not necessarily related to the folk tales of the Xhosa society, but their creation. But in those creations, there's a lot of Christian values, love thy neighbor, do this, and which I'm not saying that are any different from Xhosa or African values for that matter. But there's lots of indoctrination about Christianity. And then Isithunywa Senyanga, again, that's it was short-lived, only 5 issues. And Indaba was one of the longest surviving, with a longer lifespan as well. I'm just going to rush through them. Kafir Express, this one is very important for my research because most of the people who write, this is supposed to be 1817 to 1808 now. I'll correct that. I'll give you the under pressure now. But Kafir Express is very important for my research because a lot of the people who write during that period and write for this newspaper specifically. And it was one of the first newspapers to be edited by a Xhosa-speaking editor. The first one being Jabavu, and then when Jabavu left to start Imvo Zabansundu, which is one of the longest surviving newspapers, then Oba, who I'm going to be talking about, takes over as an editor and then writes profusely about various topics. And then Imvo Zabansundu, like I said, Jabavu leaves Isikitimi and goes to Imvo, establishes Imvo. Actually, it's one of the newspapers that does not have a genesis from the missionary. It was started by Africans, and there was no control whatsoever about what gets disseminated. There's interesting history there if any one of you know Khubusana, because Khubusana puts together an anthology of I would say Xhosa literature in Zemkingo Magwalandini, and the selection of which newspapers, which pieces of literature published in which newspapers should make it into that collection is very interesting, because again, there was these rivalries between the two. And then there is Bato, which publishes in 1912, prior to the formation of the ANC, and in 2012, I think it was, when Peter Lim published that. I can't remember exactly when the book was published, but in celebrating the ANC centenary, Peter Lim published a collection of articles about the ANC that come from this newspaper. So this one is dubbed the ANC multilingual newspaper, and it published in various languages, not only isiXhosa. So as you can see, it's Abantu, which is a Nguni language, and Batu, which is Sotho. Umthetheli Wabantu publishes specifically, is based around Joburg in the mines, and from that newspaper we discover another phenomenal, or rather a phenomenal woman. Up to that point, no one knew that there was a woman in Xhosa society, in Xhosa, who wrote credible literature in newspapers. So this woman, Nontsizi Mgwetho, writes in the newspapers, and Jeff Opland needs to be credited for really identifying her, Nontsizi Mgwetho, and publishing her work. Then Bantu World it's much younger. I don't know if any of you know Noni Jabavu, the daughter of DDT Jabavu, who goes to the UK at 14 and comes back here and writes in that newspapers and travels in the diaspora. I think I am highlighting this because I think we all know, and I know that there are some historians who work from newspapers. I'm actually highlighting these so that maybe there's a justification for what I'm doing in terms of how is it that we can use newspapers in collecting and making sense of knowledge that has up to maybe more recently that is not known. How do we make sense of, how do we interpret that as history? Maybe I can say that, is it history or not? My argument is that anything that gets committed on paper, actually, let me say, if something gets committed into paper and is a result of people's experience, then it should be history. So you must excuse me, I said I'm not a historian, so if I'm interpreting what history is incorrectly, bear with me, but that's my interpretation. But then, so there's an aspect of literacy, of committing something written down into paper, and that is a result of people's experiences. So that's history from a perspective where there is a long history of reading and writing in a society. This history is written immediately after the point of contact of these societies with pen. So what they know a lot relates to what they've kept in memory for centuries of time. So for centuries, for years. So it's important, therefore, for us when we analyze it, we keep that in mind. So they are committing something in paper that they've known through generations about the society. And for me, that is history. So newspapers are important, even if they have a short lifespan. We know that they've got a short lifespan because, as you can see from the images of these newspapers that I'm working with are tattered. You open a page and these things just break, most of them. There are others, for instance, in Cape Town, where we're not allowed to open them because they are actually you can't use them. Others, fortunately, have been put on microfilm, and there's an archive now that has put together newspapers in African languages, but not all of them can be collected. So newspapers are important, but they've got a short lifespan. I want to go back then to other intellectuals. I think in writing, the intellectuals, who I call these people early intellectuals, there have been contestations or confusion. I don't know if it's maybe for lack of a better word in English, I'll say contestation within self about how a system or an ideology like Christianity, we know the Christian values, and I've said earlier on, love thy neighbor and so forth. How a system, how an ideology like that can then look down upon people's ideologies that has been in existence for time immemorial. So people have been in conflict with that, and we're not allowed to talk about issues that were pertinent in African societies, in newspapers, and therefore they use these newspapers to talk back to that power. They could not write in normal volumes. But two important things about that is that they wrote in their own language. So they could escape missionary control because of the medium in which they wrote. Second thing is that they did not write in normal form, prose that we write when we write for newspapers. They wrote in literary form. So they wrote poetry in stanzas and so forth, but mostly poetry. So people, when missionaries looked through the text, scanned through the text, they would interpret them just as poetry, piece of literary work, and not pieces of literature or political instigation or so they didn't view it as such. I just want to make an example of a writing that was published by the Riebeeck Society. It's Wauchope, and it writes in 1882 about this talking back to power. And early this morning, I removed all the Xhosa and remained only with English, just because it will be easier for me. So if you can read that, your cattle are gone, my countrymen, go rescue them, go rescue them. Leave the bridge holder alone and turn to the pen. Take paper and ink, for that is your shield. Your rights are going, so pick up your pen, load with ink, sit in your chair. repair, not to Ho. Ho was this forest where people retreated to when they're fighting. But fire with your pen. So the idea that the pen can do better what a gun or an assegai would do was preached there. And so also the important thing that I get to talk about later is the idea that people called upon people to do this. It was not a Wahope only writing or inciting. That's an English word? Inciting? Yeah, inciting people to write. But he would get people's views, obviously telling them the reasons behind that. So this thing, the important point I try to make here is that knowledge production in Xhosa society was a communal exercise. So it was not a Pamela Maseko presenting a lecture like that. It was, if I presented something, it was something that was done by a community. So I think the idea of an archive as well, that I get to talk, if I get a chance to talk about later, is if now these works have been collected in an archive and are owned by an individual, what does it mean for that? Because knowledge production in Xhosa was a communal exercise. So there's a lot that they wrote about. They wrote about events, local and national scale, extent to which the Western value system impinged on local value system, and condemning the manner in which local population succumbed to, sorry, the writing is so small, I need my glasses, succumbed to destructive Western value system. So during for instance, the Industrial Revolution in South Africa, the 1850s, the 60s, the gold and diamond discovery. There's lots of, well, there was they introduced the migrant labor system, but there was the writings of these people condemn the change in behavior that has been influenced by these, by the introduction of this labor system. So a lot of that is written about. The important thing that runs through the thread that every one of these writers write about is the importance of the Bible and Christianity. They quote the Bible like nobody's business. They quote from Genesis right up to Revelations. They know the Bible in and out. They make reference to occurrences in these Bible things, and they compare them to what is happening in Africa. And so they know it very well and embrace it, but they almost condemn it as an agent of cultural and linguistic dispossession at the same time. So there's this conflict within themselves. How can something so good, so valuable, be in conflict with one's lived experience? So just key historical moments that are important for when we talk about, they write about colonialism up to apartheid. And you can see the writings I'm looking at is right from 1840s right up to 1944, when, for instance, Mkai, the last writing of Mkai before he died in 1945. So they write about the account of writing of the language, the African's view of the account of the writing of the language. The early grammars, if there are any grammarians here or linguists here, you would know that they've been written solely by English-speaking missionaries. So they write, these people, in newspapers about their interpretation of the grammars of the missionaries. So they write about the conflict, the 100-year frontier was the pertinent, the important, the cattle killing of Nongause. They write about the Industrial Revolution, the Anglo-Boer War, the Union, the 1912, the intense and resolute black political resistance, and up to apartheid, as I've indicated. So now, just running to the, or trying to rush to the archive, what's really important when people talk about newspaper writings in isiXhosa and this effort, we forget its genesis. Is that it starts with A.C. Jordan. Many of you might know him for his classical novel, The Wrath of the Ancestors, translated from isiXhosa, Ingqumbo Yeminyanya. And in writing an account of Xhosa literature in 1940s, a book that was published in 1957, he states clearly that there is a lot of Xhosa literature in the form of the writings of the early intellectuals that exist in newspapers. And he does quote Goba, again, who I'm going to make reference to. He quotes Goba about, I think, specifically the great debate, the great education debate, writes about that. And then he mentions people by name, Tsiko, who we're going to be publishing in 2020, and quite a few other people. So the first person to identify the writings of the early intellectuals in newspapers was A.C. Jordan. In 1977, a student of A.C. Jordan writes a PhD also on the works of Mkai, who writes in newspapers as well, in 1977, and it's still available online. And then Jeff Opland then hinges on the work that has been done by these people, and also people like Andre Odendahl. But it's easy for him, for various reasons, to do this research. He goes to the various libraries, photocopies loads and loads of writings by people, these different people that I'm going to be talking about, and then the publications emanating from these collections are what we're going to be talking about more later on. And I just need to also say that Rhodes University, the African Language Studies project, so department, houses the National Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences Research Hub on African Languages and Literary Heritage. And that is in collaboration with the Opland in republishing these works into proper volumes. Just images, and I need to mention a lot of people who have worked in this. So Opland is acknowledged as leading in this, but has worked with Kusen, Tantala, Jordan, Moropa, Ndwana, Nyamende, Mtuze, and others. Because it's texts that are written in the 19th century, so it's old orthography written in isiXhosa. So it needed translation into English by Xhosa-speaking people who would understand that kind of language written at that time. So I think another thing that I forgot to mention is that these texts, the republication of these texts, we present the text in isiXhosa, original text, original writing, and then in the facing page we provide an English translation, so that you're not scared that if you can buy them, you'll be able to read, or you can acquire them, whichever way you would be able to make sense of them because they are in translation. These first two volumes, this one specifically, where's the thing now that helps? This one specifically is published with Elizabeth's, the Riebeeck Society. And excuse me now, Elizabeth, I can't remember when it was the year of publication. That's fine. But it was amongst the first, and I think 2008. Okay, I think it's important for publishers like this or houses like that to be acknowledged, because at this point we are experiencing in different ways a kind of prejudice against African languages from the publishing houses. So to have a structure like that, and UKZN Press, who we're working with, and UNISA Press and Vets Press publish these books, is a big thing, because there is no monetary value in publishing these texts. So we are working with them because they need to be disseminated. So this was 2008. The first one to have appeared is Abantu Besizwe, which is also collections of Mkai's works, published by Vets Press, UNISA Press, UNISA, in 2006, followed by this woman that I talked about earlier on, Nontsizi Mgwetu, very, very interesting poetry, specifically on Christianity, that conflict I was talking about, but also because he was publishing in Umthetheli Wabantu in Joburg, and there is no accurate biography of him, except that she came from Whittlesea and went to work in Joburg as a domestic worker. There's nothing we can work with. But with that assumption, there is, it's almost clear that he's observed the degeneration of moral value of Africans, of the native population. And then there are these 3 volumes that are published under the Xhosa Upland literature collection with the UKZN, published in collaboration with Rhodes University. This is Goba, and I'm going to talk more about it. And Solilo, this one she writes, she's from Uitenhage, and is also follows this theme of writing Christianity, history, political commentary, and so forth. And Mkai, well-known people, specifically Jeff. I think in the series we all have favorites. My favorite is Goba, hence I'm talking about it now for various reasons. And Jeff, as favorite is Mkai. And his analysis of the work is that someone like Mkai can be compared to Shakespeare. And often when I say that, people say, no way. First, my students say that, actually, no way. I think specifically because there is no appraisal of his work. There is no valuing of his work. It is not widely disseminated. It is not known. And we know that knowledge gets value if it is appreciated in that way, especially in contexts like this. And in the next the next volume of the series is works of Robert Godfrey, who writes about ornithology, the bird science. Is it ornithology? Yeah. Writes about that. The interesting thing about this, we really struggled whether we include him in the series or not, because we said earlier on is that we are focusing on writings in isiXhosa by African intellectuals. And so what was important about this is that she was not African as in pigmentation, but he wrote about the knowledge of isiXhosa. And what is pertinent about that, what's important about that work is that when we analyzed it, looking at his collection of bird names, bird habits, and so forth from isiXhosa-speaking people, and comparing them from his experience as an ornithologist. He came from the UK as an ornithologist, and coming here and finding that for every concept that he had in English, from the general name of a bird, scientific name, the habits and so forth, and the law about a certain bird, it compared completely with what he had. So that's the argument I raised in writing an introduction about this work, is that the debates in higher education is that African languages are not intellectualized enough to be used at high level of thinking. My argument is that perhaps they are not, but they were at some point intellectualized. And so the process of de-intellectualizing them was 100, 200-year period. And then if we're talking about intellectualization, we should be talking about re-intellectualization and not just intellectualization. This one is interesting as well. It's Imbali Zamandulo. It's coming up in 2019. Imbali Zamandulo is an anthology of works of literature, of history. That would be interesting for historians. And it's the first anthology of history written in isiXhosa by isiXhosa-speaking intellectuals. And then we have Jonas Nziko coming up in 2020. We've just worked on this. And then we have another one where a PhD student has just submitted a thesis on the selected biographies of biographical poems of Nkai, coming up in 2021. I'm looking at the time, and I'm going to rush through some of these things. I just want to look at the kind of texts that Chikopa wrote. I can talk briefly about his bio later if the need arises. But we're talking about someone who writes about the history of his cause. What's really interesting for me is that he acknowledges that because in memory you tend to forget some things. So he does acknowledge that what they remember, what he remembers, starts somewhere. And it should suffice that there is a point where we should start, and people must add or take away depending on what is remembered. But he disputes what he says. He says the introduction should suffice for all those who thought Xhosa history identifies Ndu with Adam from Umdu. He says history does not go back to Adam. It knows nothing of him or even whether there was such a person. We begin with Ndu because that is as far as our memory of ancient time goes. So this is that. And then he writes about language description. I spoke earlier on about how they, maybe I should say, added value or more value to the language description of the missionaries. Here, the English have no distinction between ejective and aspirated sounds. So, like for instance, if I say b, English doesn't have that sound. So they don't have implosives, they only have explosives. So you have ba. But Xhosa has got both sounds. So in converting the language into print, the English didn't make that distinction. But the Xhosa engage with that. But Oba writes here that that's trying to find where he acknowledges that this writing came with people who had no understanding of the phonology of the Xhosa-speaking people, and therefore it's important that it is engaged with. And then other important thing is that the knowledge and the history of isiXhosa in most societies is ingrained in the proverbs, the idioms, and all that. And he writes extensively in the same way that Wauchope writes, in fact, about the idiom, and then interprets the philosophy of the society behind the idiom. And what's important about this idiom specifically, he says, he talks about how Nzikane sold said this. So this Ukwekwelo clearly said, or said this idiom to Nika for raising the Grahamstown whites, a foreign nation, when he was fighting Dlambe and Kaleka. He said to Nika, why when you are fighting against your own nation do you seek assistance from a foreign nation? What will you say if they stick to your nation like a wild dog? How do you pronounce that? Mange. Yeah, that's right. Okay, so there's that. And the pass laws, there's extensive writing about the legislation of the time. What is important here is how the concept of indirect rule, how a minority get to inject fear to a big minority, and how they use their own to control a population. And in this, a majority population. In this case, Goba writes about an instance where an uneducated, could I say, control officer, past control officers, meets and a person, I think meets him specifically, or is told about this. And he's supposed to carry a pass in a tin thing around his neck, and this officer cannot read. And so he takes this person and travels kilometers back from the direction where they came, so that this can be read by a white official, because the person can't read. So things like those, and for me, is the concept of how black people were used to keep the order of the British at the time. And then land dispossession, there's a lot about this, and the hard text. What is interesting about this, writing in 1878 about the hard text, is how often the understanding, or what we get to hear in the academy about issues of gender in Xhosa society, is that women are oppressed, they don't own any means of wealth, land, livestock, and so forth. So at the introduction of the hard text in 1878, Goba, these are minutes of a meeting, the Native Association of the Association of Native Educators, something to that effect. So these are minutes. So he implores the people at the meeting that they should go out and help widows, the old people and women generally, and the poor, to get title deeds, because up to that point, women owned land. But with the introduction of the hard text, then they had to have title deeds. Or, not they had to have, it's only men who had to have title deeds. But so an indication here that, okay, if it's required by law that they should have title deeds, then you get men to go and assist them to get them. Just want to do this. Maybe I should end with this, which kind of summarizes what I'm doing, the relationship between literacy, knowledge, and power. Kopa writes in 1877 that there are reasons for me not to remain idle, but to deal briefly with minor aspects of history, motivated as I am by national envy in doing so. My fervent desire is that our history should be well known and brought into print, because all nations who possess a history continue to live and do not die, even if they are fragmented. We are taught the history of the nations of Greece, Rome, Egypt, of English, and so on, who they were and what they are today. Thus, they are very much alive, because even we who never shared their experiences or saw them, at least today we know something about them through their historical books. We see them, we discuss them, and make an example of some of their sayings and habits as reflected in their present-day legacy. So the issue of power, the issue of knowledge is that for any powerful nation to exist, its history has to be written down. But more than that is the power of writing, is that once something is committed in paper, then we value it. And through valuing it that way, it continues, people add on it, onto it, and grow the value of that society. I think I'm going to end there. I can quickly, I want to end there so that if there is any questions, we can. In this time, I think it says it's 15 minutes, so I've got 10 minutes for question time, if there are questions. Okay, can I take maybe 2 or 3 questions at a time? And if there's none, I can answer. Okay, I'll take that.
Yes. I was wondering how the periodicals and the early newspapers of the 1834, so very early papers that were materialistic, how were they financed? You only start seeing advertisements in around about the light of Rhodes, those papers that are put from to see.
Mm-hmm.
There doesn't appear to be any advertisements that finance things like periodicals
Mm-hmm.
in the early Britain.
Okay. Okay. Is there any other question I can take, or should I respond to that? Any question? Any other question? So she's asking how were the newspapers financed? My understanding is that there was a need for the early newspapers were supported by the missionaries until the breakaway with Isikitimin and Imvo Zabansundu. So the missionaries funded them, obviously through the support of the different societies, missionary societies, because I came across a writing where one missionary in appraising the idea of these periodicals say that it's important for us to know what these people think. It's important for us to read for ourselves what comes from them. So it was important for reporting what was happening in the countries outside, in the colonies, basically. So my understanding is that they were funded by the missionaries, who themselves got money from, got funding from the societies abroad.
You mentioned a number of times that the missionaries controlled whatever would be published in Dispossession. One would assume that missionaries are there, as you mentioned, with the aim of Christianization and education. But you also mentioned that they had a colonial agenda. One would assume that the missionaries have no time for political arguments. So what I would like to ask you, what do you mean by the colonial agenda in terms of what the missionaries used as a measure of control?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Can I take another question? Can I respond to that? You want to take? Okay. Thanks.
Just a question. in my memory,